ER students, I'm so glad that you are here today watching this video. And if you watched last week's video, we talked about the importance of recognizing our identity, not in who we are, but whose we are. We also talked about finding our identity that we need to seek, dwell, and tell. And I want to continue talking about that thought today. And so I wanted to start off by letting you know that I'm a guy who loves literature. The composing of words to create beautiful stories is what I live for. And so today we're going to look at one of the most profound works, a deeply moving story, a composite of literary masterpiece, The Ugly Duckling. Didn't see that coming, did you? So there's a bunch of baby eggs and they're all hatched and these sweet little baby ducklings come out, but there's one large egg. And when it finally hatched, inside was a nasty, ugly duckling. The farm animals would laugh at how ugly the duckling was. They would comment on how clumsy and ugly this little ducky was, and until the ugly duckling had had enough. And so he sets out on an adventure looking for other ducks that look just like him. And he waddled up to animal after animal and asked, "Have you seen any ducks that look like me?" And they would laugh and they would say, "I've never seen a duck that looks like you. You are the ugliest duck that we have ever seen." And finally, the ugly duck had had enough. And so he went by himself and he hid. And autumn came and the leaves turned golden and the duck was sad and all alone. Winter came and then finally spring. And as the flowers blossomed, the pond became back to life. And the ugly duckling from his hiding place saw a beautiful swan swim by. And the ugly duckling comes out of his hiding place, but was so afraid to ask. He had been teased his entire life, but he built up the courage and asks, "Have you seen any ducks that look like me?" And the swan stops and she says, "You're not a duckling and you are not ugly. You, my friend, are like me, a beautiful swan. Come and join the rest of us." And the ugly duckling looked down at his reflection and realized who he really was. And so I love that story, and I'm sure most of you love that story. And I think it's because we can all identify a time in our lives when we felt like that ugly duck. That feeling of not belonging, going one place to another and trying to fit in with everyone else. But the problem was, the ugly duckling had no idea who he was. It was his identity that he didn't know about. So let's talk about identity. Well, what is identity? Well, it's how you see yourself. It's how you define yourself. And identity is so important because how you define yourself determines on what you do and how you live. So my question for you is this: where do you find the best version of who you are supposed to be? So I was a kid in college and I was working at the coffee shop on campus at Lubbock Christian, and I became great friends with the owner. And one day I was working and he says, "Hey, do you want to make some extra money?" And I'm like, "Oh, sure, absolutely." And so on a Saturday, he took me and a couple of other employees out to a warehouse. A warehouse that he owned. And I was like, who needs a warehouse to run a coffee shop? But after he got the locks off and he opened up the doors, there were rows and rows of cars that needed to be moved. And I'm talking about like 1967 Mustangs, Stingray Corvettes, old Buicks, and so many more. And as we were moving these cars on a trailer to another warehouse, my imagination just starts going. How cool would it be if I could drive one of these? And I actually got to. I drove a 1993 V10 red Jaguar. That thing was smooth. But besides that one, those cars had a purpose. They were not a purpose to sit in a warehouse like a museum. But when you see those cars, you see that they were created. They were designed for a purpose. And some of them were designed to go really, really fast and to look so incredibly cool. And others were designed to take families from point A to point B safely. But regardless, when those cars were created, they were not built to just sit in a museum collecting dust. Hello, you are not just built to look the part. You are not built to just look like a follower of Christ, look like someone who just goes to church. You are built for something so much more. And the creator of the cars knew that, and your creator knows that about you as well. You might be familiar with the name Mark Zuckerberg. If you don't, he's the guy who invented Facebook. He was 19 years old. It was 2004 and in his college dorm room. But what you need to know is that the dude since middle school was creating programs. His friends were playing video games and Mark was creating them. And so when he created Facebook, it was a huge success. The very first year, Facebook had 1 million active users. Other larger companies began to take notice, and within just 2 years of Facebook's existence, he had offers ranging from $10 million to $1 billion to sell Facebook. Now, to a 19 or 20-year-old me, that kind of money would be tempting to just accept it. But the difference between me and Mark Zuckerberg is that Mark created Facebook. He saw the vision of what Facebook could be. He didn't just stop at the 2-year mark and go, well, this is pretty good stuff, so let's just sell it. But instead, he saw what it could be. And he didn't quit working hard. And today, Facebook has a market capitalization of $646 billion. You see, that's the difference when you, as the creator, know what your creation can do. You're not going to sell it short. And let me tell you something. You have a creator that knows exactly what you can do. And he is not going to sell you short because there is more inside of you. Where do you find your identity? You find it from your creator. I love the story of David. Even as a young man, things just didn't go his way. The youngest of 7 brothers, and one day a prophet came to his family's house, and God told him, the next king of the country will be found in the house of Jesse. So he shows up to the house and he says, Jesse, one of your sons is going to be the next king. I need you to bring them all before me. And guess what? David's dad brings his 6 older brothers before the prophet and leaves David out in the field to take care of the sheep. Like his dad thought that one of these boys will be picked and David wouldn't even be considered. And the prophet looks at the older brothers and God speaks to him and says, it's not one of them. There's someone else. And finally, David is called in and he is anointed as the next king. But the story doesn't stop there, because the next thing that happens is the country goes to war. You might have heard about the guy named Goliath. I mean, he was a giant of a man, and he's standing out taunting the Israelites, taunting God, challenging them to send one person to fight him. And David shows up as a delivery boy for his dad, bringing supplies and food to his older brothers, and they give him so much grief. Like, dude, why are you even here? You see, he heard that stuff his whole life, but then as he was about to head home, he hears the booming voice of Goliath, taunting the army, making fun of God, and David gets mad. And he goes and he says, I will fight this giant. And everyone looks at him with so much doubt. And he says, I hear what you're saying about me, but it doesn't matter what you say, because David knew that there was someone bigger who said things about David that no giant could ever overcome. And he listens to his identity in God, and he steps up to the giant and he slays him. David had the confidence to step forward because he knew what mattered was what God said. And he knew that God was with him. Students, your God is with you. And you would think something like slaying a giant, things would just get a whole lot easier for him, but they don't. In fact, things got harder for him. Because now the king labeled him as a traitor and someone who needed to die. And David jumped from cave to cave, hiding and fearing for his life. But David never gave up because he knew who he was. He knew his Creator. He spent time with his Creator. He knew the sound of God's voice. He spent time in worship. He spent time getting to know who this God was. So that when he faced all these challenges, when you and I face challenges, when you feel like you just can't go any further and you just want to give up, you don't have to listen to what everyone else is saying about you, because just like David, you have the ability to know what God says about you. You have the ability to open up your Bible. You have the ability to worship every day. The only one keeping you from spending time with the Creator is you. And so you can do something about it today. Pleasant Ridge, know your identity. Learn it from your Creator. That's where we find where our identity comes from, by spending time with Him. God has called you to so much more than you might think. You are not an ugly duckling. You are not just created to be a car in a museum. You are valuable, and your Creator sees your potential, and He will never sell out on you. And just like David, he was able to endure so much and accomplish so much because he spent time with his Creator. And so today, you find your identity by knowing what the Creator says about you. You might feel like you don't belong or that you aren't good enough, but God says you're His child. You might feel like you could never reach the potential that you feel so much pressure, but God says you're His masterpiece. You might mess up and wonder if God still loves you, but God says, I will rejoice over you with singing. You might have so much going on in your head and you struggle with anxiety and fear, but God says He hasn't given you a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. Our Creator says some incredible things about you, but you could live your whole life and not know what those things are if you don't get to know Him and His Word. So that's the challenge. You want to know your identity? Know your Creator. That's where your best vision of your life comes from. Not from you, but from He who created you.